Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of this series where we're learning a lot about countries and hoping that they come up at dinner parties. My name is Kate Miller. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode where we are talking about Istanbul, the city at the centre of the world. And just before we get into it, if you haven't watched my videos before, here is a quick disclaimer. I do not claim to know everything. I'm not the only source of truth. Please go and do your own research. I do make sure to do my research as responsibly as possible. So I hope that it is as accurate as it can get when we're talking about history, which is often subjective. Obviously, any additions and comments, please do make them. Join the discussion in the comments section. I absolutely love hearing from you all. So yeah, let's just get into it. I am recording today at 9:30 a.m. on Wednesday the 25th of February from Istanbul, which is fantastically exciting. I've been in the city for 5 days total, doing my very best to explore the culture, the history, the geography of it, and really get my hands into it rather than just sitting and reading books as I usually do. So this is such an exciting video to be making, being here actually in the city. And I have to say, it is absolutely magnificent. So without further ado, let's get into it. Istanbul. Part 1, the hinge of the world. Picture a map of the world. Draw a line from Europe to Asia. Draw another one from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Now look at where those two lines cross. Right there, exactly at that point, for 8,000 years, people have been building a city, fighting over it, dying for it, reinventing it, and building it again. That city is Istanbul. And today we're going to tell its story. So here's something that took archaeologists completely by surprise. In the early 2000s, workers were digging a rail tunnel beneath the Bosphorus, one of the great engineering projects of the modern era. And they started finding things in the sediment that had absolutely no business being there. We're talking pottery, animal bones, the foundations of structures which have been preserved for millennia in this waterlogged earth beneath this very busy river. These were Neolithic settlements, evidence of permanent human habitation dating back to approximately 6,700 BCE. 6,700 years before the Common Era, before writing, before the wheel, before the Bronze Age. The people who camped on that European shoreline weren't building any sort of empire. They were farmers, and they chose this spot because it had fresh water, fertile land, extraordinary fishing, and I love this more than anything, it's what archaeologists distinctively call an instinctive, pre-rational sense that this was a good place to be. And you really feel that as well when you're actually here walking over that big bridge which connects two of the sides together. You can see all sorts of people throwing their fishing rods into the Bosphorus, and the amount of fish that they're collecting is absolutely momentous. Fish of all different colours with these strange faces, bulbous eyes, and when you walk through the fish markets, that's just evidence of how lively and populous this river is. So these Neolithic farmers, they were right. It turns out that they were more right, in fact, than they could possibly have imagined. The geography surrounding Istanbul is everything. The Bosphorus, this narrow channel of water, it's barely half a mile across at its tightest point, is the only navigable route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So for any civilization that wanted to move armies, grain, silk, or just project power between Europe and Asia, there was simply no going around it. So Istanbul didn't merely occupy a strategic location, it was the strategic location, the hinge upon which the world turned. And the world, it turns out, really needed that hinge. Part 2, the city that couldn't fail. So the Greeks arrived around 657 BCE. It was a fleet from Megara led by a man named Byzas, or, so the legend goes, who had consulted the oracle at Delphi before setting out. The oracle told him to settle across from the land of the blind. Now, what on earth could this mean? Of course, like any oracle, it is completely obscure and confusing. And you can imagine as Byzas is sailing across over to what is now Istanbul, he was thinking, well, how can I find this land of the blind? Well, when Byzas arrived at the Bosphorus, he found that others had in fact beaten him there. There was a Greek colony who already occupied the Asian shore, a place called Chalcedon. And he looked at what they had chosen, this flat, modest ground. He looked at the other side, this commanding triangular peninsula on the European shore. It had a magnificent natural harbour which curved into the northern flank and a high defensive ground. So there was complete control over the only navigable passage between the two seas. And he understood immediately what the oracle actually meant. The Chalcedonians, he concluded, must indeed have been blind. So he planted his colony on the European shore, and the oracle's riddle resolved itself, and the city took its first name, after Byzas, Byzantium. Or there's perhaps a much older Thracian word, reshaped around the story of Byzas, but either way, it grew very wealthy with a speed that surprised no one who understood where it sat. So every ship that passed through the Black Sea and the Aegean passed through the Bosphorus. Every ship passing through the Bosphorus passed Byzantium. The city then charged tolls, of course. You know, like when you're driving down the M25 or any other major road, they're often charging tolls. Well, they did that for ships who were coming through this particular strait. The city also fished these extraordinary rich waters. It traded the grain and furs and amber and wine. And Turkish wine, I have to say, is fantastic from first-hand experience. I've never had Turkish wine before I came on this trip, and it is absolutely brilliant. And within a few generations, it became one of the most prosperous cities in the Greek world. Not because of genius, but because the geography surrounding it essentially gives this place no choice but to be successful. So the symbol of modern Istanbul is a crescent and a star, and you'll recognize it from the Turkish flag and also Islamic flags all around the world. It's become the major symbol of Islam. But actually, it has its origins in an event that happened here in 340 BCE. So Philip II of Macedonia, he was the father of Alexander the Great, who you might have heard of, besieged Byzantium and was so close to nearly having it. But the siege failed. And it failed in part because of this sudden flash of light in the night sky that betrayed a secret Macedonian assault. So as the troops were coming down to assault the city, they were discovered by this miraculous lightning. So the grateful citizens adopted the crescent and the star as their city's emblem in commemoration of this magnificent act. So if you think about that, it's very interesting. It's a symbol born from a Greek city's deliverance from a Macedonian king. And that symbol has then become the symbol of the Ottoman Empire, and through it has become the most widely recognized symbol in the world. Istanbul has a way of doing that, of containing contradictions so enormous that they shouldn't fit inside a single city. It is the purest form of a melting pot. Chapter 3. Rome, a saint, and a dome that floats. So Rome arrived the way that Rome usually arrives when we hear these stories about how the Romans make new cities, gradually, very gradually, and then suddenly, all at once. And by the 2nd century of the Common Era, Byzantium was a prosperous Roman provincial city, important enough to sort of keep around, but not quite important enough for any sort of special attention. It was just part of the larger empire. And then it backed the wrong man in a civil war, a general named Pescennius Niger, who lost. And the winning emperor, Septimus Severus, was not merciful. Completely the opposite, in fact. He besieged the city for 3 years, then sacked it with the systematic thoroughness that Roman armies applied to those who made them fight hard for things, So absolutely brutal, we're talking. But he was also intelligent enough to realise what he had nearly destroyed. We've spoken about how absolutely indispensable this place was. And so even as the ruins were still smoking, he was making these plans to figure out, how can we rebuild this city? How can we commission it on a grander scale than it was before? So he came up with new baths, a new hippodrome, new public buildings, and this lesson embedded itself into the city's DNA. If you destroy Istanbul, you only create this more expensive problem, because the location demands a city, and so the city will always have to be rebuilt. The most consequential moment in ancient history came at 324 CE, where the Emperor Constantine defeated his rival at a battle fought on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, quite literally within sight of the European side. And with that victory, he became the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire. And so he was then immediately faced with this question of, great, I have everything. This is the whole empire. What do I now do with it? And Rome, the old capital, had started to become a bit of a problem. Its aristocracy was pagan, and Constantine was determined to make Christianity the empire's defining faith. Rome was also increasingly too far from the empire's most threatened frontiers. It just wasn't really a convenient place to be. And bear in mind, you don't have Turkish Airlines and Transavia and Pegasus to fly you everywhere at 3.5 hours notice. It would take days and weeks to get here from Rome. So Constantine, whether moved by his genuine divine vision or just brilliant strategic logic, dressed in like a religious costume, basically, chose the Bosphorus. So whether it was a religious reason or strategic, we don't know, but he made this decision to base the home of the Roman Empire in the Bosphorus. On November the 11th, 324, he began laying out a new city. He wasn't replacing Byzantium, but dwarfing it. So it had 7 hills, like Rome, forums, palaces, an expanded hippodrome. And he stripped the statues, the columns, the artwork from cities all across the empire to fill its public spaces with the accumulated grandeur of classical civilization. And on May 11th, 330 CE, the new city was formally dedicated. It was called Nova Roma, New Rome, just like how we called New York, New York at the beginning. But within a single generation, it was known by the name it would carry for the next 11 centuries: Constantinople. The old Rome watched from the west, and the new Rome commanded the entire world from the east for the first time. By the 6th century, Constantinople's population had climbed to perhaps 500,000 people, making it the largest city in the world. Its markets overflowed with silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, and grains from Egypt. And the city's emperor conducted himself according to ceremonial protocols that were so elaborate that foreign ambassadors sometimes fainted during audiences, just due to their sheer length of the proceedings. And then in January 532 CE, everything nearly ended. So a riot began in the Hippodrome, the great stadium seated for 100,000 people. This is the city's main venue for chariot racing, followed by the tribal intensity that commands football today. So imagine this loud, vibrating Hippodrome. There are these 2 rival factions, the Blues and the Greens. And they set aside their differences to come against the government. So there was already some dissent, right? And it got to the point where all of the dissenters joined forces to come against the government. So what started as a sports riot became, within hours, a revolution. The city burned and 30,000 people died when troops finally suppressed the uprising. But something extraordinary happened amid the burning. The emperor at the time, Justinian, he was on the verge of fleeing, And his empress, Theodora, a woman of lowly origin who had risen through the theatre to become one of the most formidable political minds of her age, refused to go. Now, Theodora is an absolutely fascinating case. She was previously this exotic dancer who was known for her, how do I say this politely, command of certain types of pleasure. And Justinian had absolutely fallen in love with her. And it turns out she was really the brain of the operation. She was the definition of beauty and brains. And she refused to go. Those who have worn the crown, she is reported to have said, should never survive its loss. As for me, I shall stay. Justinian stayed. The revolt was crushed. And from the ruins of the city, he built something that stopped the world. The new Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, was completed in 537 CE, just 5 years after the fires. Its architects weren't primarily builders, they were mathematicians, and the Hagia Sophia is above all a mathematical achievement. Its central dome sits 55 metres above the floor. This is higher than the Statue of Liberty, and at its base 40 windows create a continuous band of light, so the dome appears to float unsupported, to hover above the worshippers below, like a vision rather than a structure. And medieval visitors arriving from the relatively dim and low-ceilinged buildings of their own world were constantly overwhelmed. This wasn't like other buildings, this was like walking in the sky. Can you imagine how amazing that must be? There were very few buildings like this at the time. In fact, there was nothing like this at the time. And there remains to be nothing like this. It's an absolutely unbelievable feat. Now, when Justinian entered the completed church for the first time, he walked to the centre of the nave, looked up and exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." For nearly 1,000 years, that dome was the largest enclosed space on earth, and nothing came close. Part 4. Walls, Fire, and 1,000 Years. The walls are the other great achievement of this era, and they don't get nearly enough credit. Between 412 and 413 CE, engineers built a defensive system across the base of the city's peninsula that would prove to be one of the greatest military achievements of the ancient world. This is not a single wall, it was a triple system. A broad moat, an outer wall, an inner wall, rising up to 12 metres, with towers every 50 metres. These were called the Theodesian walls. And they successfully repelled 15 separate sieges over 1100 years. Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus warriors all broke themselves against this fortification. The Theodesian walls didn't merely protect Constantinople, they protected, for over a millennium, everything that remained of the Roman civilization. And when the Arab fleets came in 674 CE and again in 717, the walls held with little help from one of the city's most terrifying weapons, Greek fire. Now, this was a petroleum-based incendiary that burned on water and could not be extinguished by any means known at the time. And Byzantine warships projected streams of this liquid flame across the surface of the sea. Had those sieges succeeded, the history of Europe would have been unimaginably different. But the walls held. Part 5. Betrayal from Within. The Fourth Crusade is one of history's most astonishing acts of treachery. It was committed not by pagans, not by infidels, but actually by fellow Christians. Now, in 1202, Crusaders gathered to march east and recapture Jerusalem. They needed Venice's fleet. They couldn't pay for it, and then one thing led to another, and in April 1204, the Crusader army stood at the gates of Constantinople, the largest, richest, most sophisticated city in the Christian world. And the temptation proved absolutely irresistible. They breached the walls and spent 3 days in a systematic pillage of breathtaking ferocity. Churches were ransacked, libraries were burned, the great bronze horses that decorated the hippodrome for 700 years were shipped to Venice, where they still stand above St. Mark's Basilica today. A drunken prostitute was placed on the patriarch's throne in the Hagia Sophia and made to sing. And that is really the turning point. The Latin Empire that rose from these ruins was at its inception completely hollow. Essentially, this was a language problem. I mean, its French and Flemish rulers couldn't speak any Greek, they couldn't command loyalty, and they couldn't defend themselves. So the city's population just collapsed. Its trade collapsed, the buildings decayed, and the greatest city in the Christian world had been brought low by the men who were supposed to be its defenders. Constantinople was eventually restored in 1261, but it was a shadow of what had been lost. 2 centuries of slow, antagonising contradiction followed. The Ottoman Turks were pressing in closer. The treasury empty, the territories gone. The dynasty ruled a state that was shrinking towards nothing. And yet, this is very remarkable, even in its death throes, the city produced extraordinary intellectual flowering. So Byzantine scholars, since in the end, began carrying their manuscripts west, to Florence, to Venice, to Rome. And the knowledge and texts that they brought, the accumulated wisdom of the civilization Rome had kept for 1,000 years, helped ignite the Italian Renaissance. How fascinating is that? The explosion of art and philosophy and science that transformed European civilization drew deeply from this Byzantine inheritance. Constantinople was dying, but it gave its gifts to the future before it went. Part 6. The Conqueror. By 1451, the Byzantine Empire consisted of little more than Constantinople itself, and the last emperor, Constantine XI, had perhaps 7,000 men only to defend walls that required 10 times that number. He sent desperate appeals across the Christian world, and practically nobody came. What came instead, in April 1453, was the army of Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. Mehmed was 21 years old, and he'd come to power with one fixed idea, nurtured since childhood: Constantinople. He studied the city's history, read accounts of every previous siege, analysed exactly how they'd failed, and commissioned the solution. This was his goal in life. A Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines who couldn't afford him, cast the largest cannons that the world had ever seen. Now you might be able to see where this is going. So one of them fired stone balls weighing 600 pounds. It took 60 oxen to move it and 200 men to operate it. It could only be fired 7 times a day before it needed to cool, but each time it fired, it sent 500 kilograms of stone into walls that had stood for 1,000 years. The siege began on April 6th. For nearly 8 weeks, the defenders held. The Theodosian walls, even under bombardment from weapons their builders could never have imagined, proved antagonizingly resistant. And then Mehmed did something that still astonishes military historians to this very day. He had his ships hauled overland on greasy wooden rails over the hill behind the Genoese settlement of Galata, and launched them into the Golden Horn from the other side of the great chain the Byzantines had stretched across the harbour mouth to keep the fleet out. The defenders woke one morning to find the harbour they considered safe bristling with enemy sails. And this psychological blow was absolutely devastating. The final assault came before dawn on May 29th, 1453. The mercenary commander who had organised the defence with extraordinary skill was wounded early in the fighting and carried from the walls. Morale collapsed. Ottoman forces found a small gate that someone in confusion had left unbarred, and they poured through. Can you imagine being the person who was responsible for locking that gate? Oh my goodness. Anyway, Emperor Constantine XI understood what was happening. He tore off his imperial insignia. He would not be taken alive. He would not be displayed as a trophy, and threw himself into the fighting. He was never seen again. His body was never definitely identified. The last emperor of Rome died in an anonymous breach in a wall, fighting for a city that was already lost. And by sunrise, on May 29th, 1453, Constantinople had fallen. The Roman imperial tradition, in some form continuous since the reign of Augustus Caesar, nearly 15 centuries earlier, was over. Just like that, in one morning, an entire era ended. Sultan Mehmed II entered the city and walked straight to Hagia Sophia. He ordered the call to prayer to sound from within it, and knelt to pray in the greatest church in Christendom, which was now, with that decision, a mosque. Then, with a practicality matching his ambition, he set about rebuilding what he had conquered. Mehmed was not, despite the terror of his siege, a man who wanted ruins. He was incredibly intelligent, incredibly cultured. He spoke 6 languages: Greek, Arabic, Persian, Latin, Serbian, and Turkish. And he read philosophy and history across multiple traditions. He saw himself not as a destroyer of Rome, but as a legitimate heir. And he allowed the Greek Orthodox to continue, guaranteed the Greek community their rights, and made clear that Constantinople, which he now renamed Istanbul, from the Greek phrase meaning simply into the city, would be a living capital, not a trophy. The city he inherited had been depopulated to perhaps 50,000 souls. Within a century, it was once again the largest city in the world. Part 7. The Golden Age. The Ottoman Empire at its height under Sultan Suleiman I, who ruled from 1520 to 1566 and whom Europeans called the Magnificent, was staggering. His armies marched into Europe and seized Belgrade, took Rhodes, crushed the Hungarian kingdom, and appeared before the gates of Phoenicia. His admiral, Pasha, made the Ottoman navy the dominant force in the Mediterranean. But Suleiman's greatest legacy, by his own account, was legal. His secular law code earned him the title Kanuni, the lawgiver among his own people. And under his pen name, he was also a poet. 3,000 lyric verses, a body of work that takes its place in the great tradition of classical Ottoman poetry. A warrior, a lawgiver, a poet. Istanbul tends to produce people of this kind. Now, the supreme genius of Suleiman's age was a man named Mimar Sinan. Born around 1490, the son of a Christian family, conscripted as a boy into the Ottoman system that took Christian children to be raised as Muslim soldiers and state servants. He rose through the military ranks as an engineer, building bridges and fortifications across the empire's campaigns, before his extraordinary talent finally reached people in power. Appointed chief royal architect in the 1530s, Sinan served for nearly half a century. He designed over 370 structures, 84 mosques, 52 smaller mosques, 57 colleges, 35 palaces, 5 aqueducts. Goodness gracious, he died in approximately 1588 at the improbable age of 98. Unbelievable that one man could design so many magnificent buildings. Now, his masterpiece in Istanbul is the Süleymani Mosque complex. Completed in 1557, looking down over the Golden Horn towards Asia, it isn't merely a beautiful mosque, it's a complete city within the city. 4 theological schools, a medical school, a hospital, a bath, a soup kitchen that fed hundreds of the poor every single day, a school for children, and the tombs of Suleiman and his beloved wife. The revenues from the complex's commercial properties funded all of its charitable institutions. It was a self-sustaining welfare system in architectural form. So Istanbul's skyline, those minarettes rising against the horizon that you can see from a 360 view, that silhouette is still one of the most recognizable in the world, and it's largely Sinan's gift. Part 8. A long decline and a young commander. Empires do not fall in a day. They tend to decline over generations. And losing a battle here, a province there, confidence everywhere, sort of until this great power finds itself fighting for its survival on the ground suddenly, on what it used to consider its heartland. And the turning point came in 1683. The Ottoman army besieged Vienna for the second time, trying once more to break the gate of Western Europe. A combined force of Austrians and Poles arrived at the last moment and scattered them in one of the great battles of European history. The Ottoman retreat from Vienna was the beginning of a reversal that would continue, with brief interruptions for 2.5 centuries. Inside Constantinople, the problem compounded. The Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that had been the backbone of Ottoman military power, had become the most reactionary kind of vested interest, resisting every attempt at modernization because modernization would render them obsolete. Now, that's a pattern we have seen over and over and over in history and modern day. So, of course, they were pushing back. And sultans who tried to reform the army faced revolt. Sultans who didn't reform the army faced defeat. So it was an impossible situation. And by the 19th century, European powers had taken to calling the empire the sick man of Europe. The reform era that followed, the Tazimat, or reorganisation, was a serious attempt to transform the Ottoman state from within. New laws were made, secular schools, a reformed army, equality before the law for all subjects regardless of religion. Some of it was implemented, some remained aspiration, as always, but a large attempt was made, very serious. And Istanbul itself changed visibly as a result. The palace, completed in 1856 on the Bosphorus shore, consciously aped the grand palaces of Europe. Steamships called at the docks, the first bridge crossed the Golden Horn. The Orient Express eventually connected Istanbul to Vienna and Paris, and the city was being dragged, not always willingly, into the modern world. So, wow, we've fast forwarded quite a bit here, and we're actually now going to start talking about the beginning of the 20th century, looking at the First World War. So, the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War actually as an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary, gambling that a German victory would restore everything that it had lost. And that gamble was absolutely catastrophic, to say the least. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 nearly broke through the Dardanelles and opened the path to Istanbul. The Ottoman defence was led in crucial part by a division commander named Mustafa Kemal. You'll recognise that name shortly. And in 1915, under cover of wartime emergency, something happened that still echoes painfully across history and international politics. The Ottoman government implemented a policy of mass deportation and killing directed against the empire's Armenian population. The death toll is estimated at between 1 and 1.5 million people, one of the first genocides of the modern era. The night it began, April 24th, is now commemorated around the world as Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. The Ottoman defeat in 1918 brought Allied warships into the Bosphorus. The last Sultan collaborated with the occupation and lost everything. And from Antalya, Mustafa Kemal, the man who had held Gallipoli, gathered the remnants of the military and launched the War of Independence. By 1922, the nationalists had won. The Ottoman Sultanate was abolished, and the last sultan was shipped out of Istanbul aboard a British warship and then died in exile in Italy. The final holder of a title that had once commanded the loyalty of 100 million people. Part 9. A new country, an old city. On October 29th, 1923, the Turkish Republic was formally proclaimed. Its capital was Ankara, a small city in the heart of Antalya, as far from the imperial Istanbul as its founders could manage. And this was not an accident, this was completely by design. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was building something new, a Turkish nation-state, secular, Western in its cultural orientation, rooted in Antalya rather than Ottoman tradition. Istanbul, with its minarets and palaces and cosmopolitan multi-ethnic population, was too much of the old world. The new world would have to be built elsewhere. Istanbul was not destroyed, it was just sidelined, it was pushed to the side, which for a city which had been at the centre of the world for 1500 years may have felt worse, actually. And Ataturk's reform swept through like a tide. The caliphate was abolished, religious law courts replaced by a civil code imported by Switzerland, and the Arabic alphabet was replaced with a Latin script. Western dress was mandatory in official contexts, and the fez was banned. And in 1934, the Hagia Sophia, which had been a mosque since the day that Mehmed II had prayed within it in 1453, was converted into a secular museum, an unmistakable signal that the new Turkey would not allow religion to define its public spaces or identity. The city's official name was changed from Constantinople to Istanbul in 1930, when Turkey formally requested the foreign postal services to use the Turkish version, and the last echo of the Roman name, which had survived every other transformation across 15 centuries, was officially, formally stilled. For all the changes, Istanbul's Greek community had survived. Specifically exempted from the 1923 population exchange, the Greeks of Istanbul kept their schools, their churches, and their patriarch. By 1955, there were about 100,000 of them, a community with roots stretching all the way back continuously to the original Megarian colonists of 657 BCE. That's 2,600 years of unbroken habitation. And then on the night of September the 6th to 7th, 1955, that community was effectively destroyed in one swoop. Organised mobs transported into the city by bus across from Antalya were equipped in advance with crowbars and hammers and provided a list of Greek-owned properties. They swept through Istanbul's neighbourhoods. An estimated 4,000 shops, 1,000 homes, and dozens of churches, schools, and cemeteries were attacked and destroyed, and at least 37 people were killed by this mob. The riots had been triggered by a false report, planted by Turkish intelligence that a bomb had damaged the house where Ataturk had been born. It was not spontaneous, it was completely organised, and its consequences were precisely what had been intended. Now, the Greek population of Istanbul, which had stood at 100,000 in 1955, fell to fewer than 50,000 by 1960. Today, perhaps 2,500 remain. A community present in the city since before Alexander the Great, gone within one generation. And this is not because they chose to go, but they were made to feel like they had absolutely no choice. At the same time as the Greeks were leaving, something else was beginning. Rural migrants from Antalya flooded into Istanbul in their hundreds and thousands, then their millions, seeking work, seeking opportunity. These are people for whom Istanbul wasn't history so much as aspiration, and they arrived faster than the city could absorb them. They built where they needed to live without waiting for permission. The Gikondo, which is a word that means literally placed overnight, spread across Istanbul's hillsides. These are informal settlements, they're self-built, they're not quite legal, and they're completely impossible to ignore. The city spread wide. Istanbul's population, which was roughly 1 million in 1950, reached 3 million by 1970, 6 million by 1980, 10 million by the end of the century. And today it holds more than 15 million people, the largest city in Europe and one of the largest on Earth. Part 10. The city that keeps on fighting. The 21st century brought Istanbul its own tests of what a city and a country can endure. In May 2013, a small group of activists gathered near Gezi Park, a modest rectangle of trees adjacent to Taksim Square, to protest the government's plan to demolish it for a shopping mall. Police dispersed them violently with tear gas and burned their tents. And what happened next surprised absolutely everyone, including these protesters. Within days, hundreds of thousands of people were in Taksim Square. Estimates suggest that at some point during the protests, 500,000 Istanbulites, roughly 16% of the city's entire population, took part. The demonstrations spread to 78 of Turkey's 81 provinces. And this was not a single movement. You had secular Kemalites, Kurdish activists, LGBTQ plus Turks, football ultras, academics, environmentalists, and simply just the fed up middle classes who had never marched before but now just felt like the right time. All uniting with a feeling that their country was being taken somewhere they hadn't chosen and hadn't been asked about. Gezi Park was the symbol, but the feeling was much larger. So the government at the time responded with immense force. 8 people were killed, thousands were injured, the protests were brutally suppressed. And the decade that followed saw press freedoms decline, judicial independence compromised, and the concentration of power in the presidency accelerate. Gezi Park, incidentally, was never demolished. Shopping mall was quietly dropped, and it still stands. Those trees still stands. And sometimes that's just what resistance looks like. On the night of July 15th, 2016, tanks rolled across the Bosphorus Bridge. Fighter jets made low passes over Ankara. Soldiers occupied the state broadcaster and forced newsreaders to announce a new government. For several hours, it was genuinely unclear whether Turkey had changed hands. Erdogan appeared via FaceTime on a television screen, calling on citizens to take to the streets. Thousands came. People physically confronted tanks. Citizens lay down in front of these armoured vehicles. And by morning the coup was over. 251 people were dead. What followed was swift and sweeping, a state of emergency that lasted 2 years. Tens of thousands of soldiers, judges, academics, journalists, civil servants were arrested or dismissed. More than 150,000 people were detained or investigated. Independent newspapers closed, universities were purged. A rich civil society Istanbul had built over decades, its think tanks, cultural organisations, independent media was fundamentally reshaped. Many of the people who built it fled abroad. And yet, Istanbul endures. In its historic core, Byzantine churches, Ottoman mosques, Roman cisterns, and Greek columns stand within walking distance of each other. Reminders that almost every civilization that has ever mattered left something here. The Hagia Sophia, which spent 86 years as a secular museum, was reconverted into a working mosque in 2020 by presidential decree. Its ancient Christian mosaics are now covered during Friday prayers and then revealed again afterwards. The same buildings serving the same purpose it always served, being the place where the current power claims the blessing of heaven. And it's fascinating to go there now. It's currently under construction, and we didn't go in because it was £50 per person, which is slightly extortionate, I have to say. Obviously, I'm sure it's worth it. It just wasn't quite for us because of the construction. But it is still a magnificent building to even see from the outside, just its size, sheer size, and the diversity in architecture and the domes. It is visible. Now, the city generates roughly 30% of Turkey's entire GDP. Its new airport is designed to handle 150 million passengers a year, and 3 bridges span the Bosphorus. More than 15 million tourists visit the old city each year. And the opposition mayor, who won Istanbul's mayoral election in 2019, had his victory annulled on a technicality, then ran again and won by a larger margin. So, in early 2025, he was arrested on charges his supporters call politically motivated. Istanbul's streets again filled with protesters. So, the city that has outlasted every empire, absorbed every conqueror, and survived every catastrophe is still fighting, as it has always fought, for its own idea of itself. There's another threat that Istanbul is facing. Beneath the Sea of Marmara, the North Anatolian Fault waits. Seismologists have warned for decades of a major earthquake. It is a matter of when, not if. A tremor in January 2026 sent 15 million inhabitants briefly to their doorways, and renewed urgent conversations about whether the city's vast informal housing stock would survive the real thing when it comes. Istanbul has always concentrated the tensions of its age. It was true when the Theodosian walls were new, and it is true now. And it's slightly nerve-wracking, hearing about the threats of this earthquake and how significant it's going to be. Sitting in Istanbul now feels like a waiting game. So the history of Istanbul, in the end, is a story about what geography does to people. The location of the city, the narrow straits, those 2 seas, those 2 continents, made it too important for any empire to ignore, too valuable for any power to leave uncontested, and too complex for any civilization to entirely claim. Those Neolithic farmers who first camped on its shores had absolutely no idea what they were beginning, and the Greek colonists who recognized its strategic genius had no idea also that their city would still be standing 2,500 years later. Constantine, who chose it as the center of the world, was absolutely right, and would remain right, long after his empire was dust. The city's names, Lagos, Byzantium, Nova Roma, Constantinople, Istanbul, were not simply labels attached to different moments in time. These are records of transformation, of the moments when the city shed one identity under the pressure of a new power and began to grow another. And yet, through all of them, something absolutely essential has persisted. The peninsula remained. The strait remained. The 7 hills remained. The Golden Horn curved into its ancient harbour. The city has always been larger than the names that it's been given. And each civilization that ruled here has tried to stamp its version of the truth into the city's stones, and each has succeeded, partially and temporarily. The Byzantine mosaics still shimmer in the Hagia Sophia, even when covered by curtains during Friday prayers. The Roman columns still stand in the old Byzantine hippodrome, now an open square where children play. And the Greek inspiration on the ancient serpent column is still legible to anyone who can read ancient Greek, nearly 3,000 years after it was made. How magnificent is that? So Istanbul doesn't erase its past in any sense. It just layers it, it covers it, it adapts, and it lives on top of it. the way all great cities do, but here it's just visible, it's dense, it's more dramatic than any place on earth. And what makes Istanbul's story so unique and so great is its representativeness. Every culture has struggled with the tension between its heritage and its ambition, between the world it came from and the world it was trying to build. Istanbul has been doing it in one of the most consequential locations on the planet for longer than almost any other city still standing, with a cast of civilizations so diverse, so formidable, that story has never been anything less than absolutely extraordinary. And that is the city. That is Istanbul. So we're just meeting that 50-minute mark, and I want to thank you all for listening. If you are still here, I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, your questions, all in the comments. So I am so excited to hear from all of you. Also, if you've been to Istanbul, please do share your experiences. And if you're from here as well or have family history here, it would be amazing to hear from you. So thank you all for listening. My name is Kate Miller. This has been the first episode of our series, If Istanbul Comes Up at a Dinner Party. Or in fact, if Byzantium comes up at a dinner party, that might be more fitting. So you can find me on all social medias, TikTok and Instagram, and Substack, of course. And for now, that's all. Goodbye.